The Seattle rain was a familiar, comforting weight on Daniel's shoulders, right up until the moment it wasn't. He had taken a detour on his walk home from Pemberton Tech, intending to buy a slice of the hazelnut cake from Café Lumière, the exact cake they had shared on their first anniversary. But as he paused outside the frosted glass window, wiping away the condensation, the world fell utterly silent. There was Carmen, his wife of 7 years. She wasn't at her architectural firm. She was sitting in a velvet booth, leaning across the marble table, her face illuminated by a smile so raw and beautifully unhinged that it stole the breath from Daniel's lungs. It was a smile she hadn't given him in years, and she was giving it to a stranger whose hand was casually, intimately stroking her wrist. If stories of shattered trust, the quiet devastation of betrayal, and the agonizing price of uncovering the truth speak to you, stay with me. This is a journey into the dark heart of a marriage built on glass. The Seattle rain did not fall. It hovered. It was a perpetual, freezing mist that clung to the collar of Daniel Foster's wool coat and beaded on the lenses of his glasses. He didn't mind it. After 9 hours of staring at millions of lines of code in the sterile, aggressively illuminated offices of Pemberton Tech, the gray dampness of the city felt like a welcome exhale. It was a Tuesday, a spectacularly unremarkable Tuesday. Daniel had left the office an hour early. A successful deployment of a major software update had left him feeling a rare spark of spontaneity. He decided to take the long way to the transit center, a route that snaked past the cobblestone corner of 4th and Pike, past Café Lumière. It was a small, aggressively French establishment. Tiny marble tables, wrought iron chairs, and a display case of pastries that tasted like butter and nostalgia. 7 years ago, in a booth near the back, Daniel had nervously pushed a small velvet box across the table to Carmen. She had cried. She had said yes. They had eaten hazelnut cake. As the neon script of the cafe sign bled red into the puddles on the sidewalk, Daniel decided he would buy 2 slices of that cake. He would take the train back to Bellevue, wait for Carmen to return from her architectural firm, and they would eat it on the kitchen island. A quiet rebellion against the midweek slump. He approached the glass storefront, reaching into his pocket for his wallet. The windows were fogged at the edges, fighting the biting cold outside with the golden, ambient warmth within. Daniel stopped. His hand froze halfway into his coat pocket. The ambient noise of the city, the hiss of tires on wet asphalt, the distant wail of a siren, the chatter of passing pedestrians, seemed to instantly drain away, leaving a ringing vacuum in his ears. 3 tables from the window, Carmen. She was wearing her camel-colored trench coat, draped elegantly over the back of her chair. Her dark hair was loose, tumbling over her shoulders in a way she usually reserved for lazy Sunday mornings. But it wasn't her presence that anchored Daniel's feet to the concrete. She was an architect. Meeting clients at coffee shops was part of her job description. It was her face. She was smiling. It wasn't the polite, measured smile she gave to difficult clients, nor was it the weary, affectionate curve of her lips she offered Daniel over dinner. This smile was luminous. It was breathless. It crinkled the corners of her dark eyes and made her look 10 years younger, completely stripped of the heavy armor she wore for the world. It was a look of pure, intoxicating vulnerability, and she was directing it entirely at the man sitting across from her. He was handsome in a way that felt expensive. Tailored suit, silver at the temples, a relaxed posture that spoke of immense self-assurance. Tyler Black. Daniel didn't know his name yet, but he knew the archetype. Through the thick glass, Daniel watched, paralyzed, as the man leaned forward. He didn't just reach for Carmen's hand. He traced the line of her knuckles with his thumb, a gesture of such practiced intimacy that it felt obscene to witness. Daniel waited for his wife to pull away. He waited for the professional boundary to be reestablished. He waited for the Carmen he knew, the fiercely independent, boundary-driven woman he had married, to appear. She didn't. Instead, Carmen turned her hand over, intertwining her fingers with the stranger's. She leaned closer across the small marble table, the very same type of table where she had once promised Daniel forever, and she mouthed something to the man. Daniel couldn't read her lips, but he could read the softening of her posture, the surrender in her shoulders. A physical wave of nausea hit Daniel so hard he had to place a hand against the cold brick of the building to steady himself. His chest tightened, a vice gripping his lungs. It wasn't just a betrayal of the body. It was a theft of her spirit. She was giving this man the best parts of herself, the vibrant, glowing parts that Daniel had assumed were simply lost to the attrition of a long marriage. He stood in the rain for 3 full minutes. A husband watching his wife be somebody else's lover. The instinct to walk inside, to shatter the glass, to overturn the table and scream until his throat bled, flared hot and violent in his chest. But Daniel was an architect of systems. He knew that reacting to a critical failure without analyzing the damage only led to a total system collapse. Slowly, deliberately, Daniel pulled his hand away from the brick. He didn't go inside. He didn't buy the cake. He turned his back on the golden light of Café Lumière and walked away into the freezing Seattle rain, the image of his wife's beautiful, treacherous smile burning a permanent hole in his mind. The Bellevue house was an architectural marvel of glass, steel, and matte concrete, a testament to Carmen's impeccable taste as a designer. Tonight, it felt like a mausoleum. Daniel sat in the leather armchair in the center of the living room, the sprawling space completely dark save for the pale amber glow of the street lamp filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He had not turned on a single light since he walked through the door 2 hours ago. He had not even taken off his damp wool coat. He was waiting. At 8:15 p.m., the low, distinct hum of Carmen's Audi pulling into the driveway broke the absolute silence. The garage door rumbled. The heavy interior deadbolt clicked open. "Daniel?" Her voice called out from the mudroom. The familiar sound of it, the slight upward inflection she always used when she was tired, sent a fresh, physical jolt of nausea through his stomach. "In the living room," he replied. His voice sounded surprisingly steady, a deadened flat line of emotion. Carmen stepped into the entryway, bringing with her the chill of the Seattle night and something else. A faint, almost imperceptible trace of sandalwood and bergamot. It was a masculine scent, and it did not belong to him. She flicked on the recessed hall lights, wincing slightly at the sudden brightness. She was still wearing the camel trench coat. "Why are you sitting in the dark?" she asked, a small, affectionate laugh escaping her lips. She walked over and leaned down to kiss his forehead. Daniel did not flinch, though every muscle in his neck pulled taut like a wire. Her lips were cool from the outdoors, but her skin radiated a strange, buzzing heat. "Just decompressing," he said, looking up at her. "Rough deployment at the office. You're late." Carmen sighed, dropping her designer leather tote onto the sofa with a heavy thud. She ran a hand through her loose dark hair, the same hair the stranger had been admiring hours ago. It was endless. The clients for the Mercer Island project wanted to go over the kitchen elevations again. "They kept me at the firm until just now.
I'm exhausted."
She lied with terrifying grace. Daniel watched her intently. He looked for the telltale signs of deception he assumed all guilty people displayed, the avoiding of eye contact, the nervous fidgeting, the overly defensive posture. There were none. She kicked off her heels, her shoulders slumping in a perfect pantomime of corporate fatigue. Her dark eyes met his, wide, clear, and seemingly honest. She is a stranger, he thought. The realization was colder than the rain outside. For 7 years, he had believed he knew every iteration of this woman. He knew her stress tells, her sleep patterns, the specific way she held her coffee mug when she was deep in thought. But the woman standing before him, complaining about fictitious clients while the memory of another man's touch still lingered in her posture, was a masterclass in duplicity. "Did you eat?" she asked, moving gracefully toward the kitchen island. "I can order something." "Sushi?" "I'm not hungry," Daniel said. He finally stood up, the damp wool of his coat heavy against his legs. The primal urge to ask her about the hazelnut cake, to ask her about the velvet booth at Café Lumière, clawed violently at the back of his throat. He could end the charade right now. He could shatter the glass house they lived in. But the memory of his unvested stock options, A decade of grueling, late-night labor at Pemberton Tech acted as a heavy iron anchor. He needed data. He needed proof. He needed a financial firewall before he burned the house down. "I think I'm just going to take a shower," Daniel said, walking past her, holding his breath so he wouldn't inhale the sandalwood again. "Okay," she called after him, her tone light and entirely unbothered. "I'll join you in a bit." Daniel walked into the master bathroom and quietly locked the door. He turned on the shower, letting the water run scalding hot, and sat fully clothed on the edge of the pristine white bathtub, staring blindly at the imported floor tiles as his entire world silently burned to the ground. At 2:14 a.m., the Bellevue house was dead silent, save for the rhythmic, steady drumming of the rain against the floor-to-ceiling glass. In the master bedroom, Carmen slept soundly, her breathing a soft, even metronome. She had fallen asleep facing away from him, wrapped tightly in the heavy linen duvet. Daniel sat in his home office at the opposite end of the hallway. The room was dark, illuminated only by the harsh, blue-white glare of his dual monitors. He was a senior software architect. His entire career was built on understanding systems, finding vulnerabilities in complex infrastructures, and patching leaks. Tonight, the system he was reverse engineering was his 7-year marriage. He did not feel anger anymore. The visceral nausea of the café had metastasized into a cold, hyper-focused clarity. If Carmen was treating their life together as a theater production, Daniel needed to see the budget. He started with the home network. Accessing the router's administrative logs was trivial. He bypassed the standard traffic, filtering the data packets specifically by the MAC address of Carmen's personal laptop and her phone. For months, he had respected the boundary of her digital privacy, believing it was the cornerstone of trust. Now, that boundary was just a firewall he needed to breach. His fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, the clicking sound sharp in the quiet room. He traced the DNS requests from her devices over the past 90 days. There were the usual hits: her firm's servers, architectural design portals, luxury furniture vendors. But nestled among the mundane traffic was a repeating anomaly. A portal for a boutique credit union, accessed primarily between the hours of 10 in the morning and noon, when she was supposedly buried in client meetings. Daniel leaned closer to the screen, the blue light reflecting in his dark eyes. He couldn't brute force a bank password without triggering security alerts, but Carmen had a fatal flaw. She valued convenience over security. He opened an old, shared iPad they kept in the living room for controlling the home audio system. He knew Carmen occasionally used it to browse Pinterest when her phone was charging. He opened the Safari browser and navigated to the credit union's login page. Her password manager, synced via a shared iCloud keychain they had set up years ago for emergencies, obediently autofilled the credentials. The screen refreshed, displaying a dashboard. Daniel stopped breathing. It was a private checking account in her name alone. The current balance was minimal, but the transaction history was a devastating narrative of premeditation. Every month, for the past 8 months, exactly $4,000 was transferred in from a separate, unknown LLC account. And every month on the 1st, that same amount was automatically drafted out. He clicked on the recurring outgoing transaction. The payee was listed simply as Meridian Management Group. This was not a fleeting indiscretion. This was not a moment of weakness or a drunken mistake in a hotel bar. This was a parallel life. She had established a secondary financial pipeline, completely bypassing their joint accounts, to fund an existence that did not include him. The sheer, logistical calculation of it sent a deep shudder down Daniel's spine. She was building an entire world behind his back, brick by hidden brick. He downloaded the statements, encrypting the PDF files and burying them in a secure, partition drive on his Pemberton Tech server. He was gathering ammunition. He logged out, cleared the iPad's cache, and set the device exactly back on the charging dock where he had found it. As Daniel stood up, his joints aching from the tension, he looked out the window into the dark, rain-soaked trees. He was married to an architect, but he was the one who finally understood the blueprint of their marriage. It was fundamentally hollow, and now he had the schematics to tear it down. The weekend arrived with a deceptive calmness. Saturday morning sunlight finally broke through the Seattle overcast, spilling across the imported hardwood floors of their bedroom in pale, golden geometric shapes. From the ensuite bathroom, the muffled, steady rush of the rainfall showerhead echoed through the heavy oak door. Carmen had been in there for 10 minutes. Daniel stood completely still near the foot of the bed. His eyes were locked on the leather weekender bag resting on the velvet chaise lounge. It was a vintage piece she had purchased in Milan, a bag she supposedly used only for overnight site visits to affluent clients. She had taken it to Portland just 3 days before the incident at Café Lumiere. The digital bank statements he had secured were damning, but they were just numbers on a screen. Numbers could be argued in court. Numbers could be spun by a skilled attorney into a misunderstanding about business expenses. Daniel needed the physical architecture of her lie. He crossed the room. The sound of the running water was his only cover. His hands, usually so steady on a keyboard, trembled slightly as he unzipped the main compartment. He felt like a burglar in his own home. He bypassed the neatly folded silk blouses and the expensive toiletry bag, pressing his fingers along the silk interior lining. He was looking for anomalies. Near the bottom corner, his fingertips brushed against a rigid, rectangular shape concealed beneath the fabric. It was completely undetectable to a casual glance, tucked into a false seam that Carmen must have painstakingly unstitched and ressaled. Daniel dug his nails into the thread. It gave way with a soft, sickening tear. He reached inside the dark, hidden cavity and pulled the object into the sunlight. It was a key, but it was not a standard brass house key. It was a heavy, brushed silver security fob, sleek and brutally modern, with a physical override key embedded in the side. The metal was cold against his palm, heavy with the weight of a secret life. Daniel turned it over. Etched onto the smooth silver surface was a stylized, minimalist logo, a sharp, geometric M, rising above a curved line. His mind instantly retrieved the data point from his late-night server audit. Meridian Management Group, the automated $4,000 monthly transfer. The Meridian was a monolithic, glass-clad luxury tower in the heart of downtown Seattle. It was notorious among the city's tech elite for its draconian security measures, private elevator banks, and absolute discretion. It was where billionaires housed their mistresses and visiting dignitaries sought refuge. It was a fortress, and Carmen had a key. The water in the bathroom abruptly shut off. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. The sudden silence was deafening. He had seconds. He shoved the key deep into his own pocket, quickly smoothed the torn lining of the bag, and zipped it shut. He stepped away from the chaise lounge just as the brass handle of the bathroom door began to turn. Carmen emerged, wrapped in a plush white towel, her dark hair wet and clinging to her collarbones. Steam billowed out behind her, carrying the scent of eucalyptus and lavender. She looked fresh, innocent, and breathtakingly beautiful. "Hey!" she smiled softly, wiping a drop of water from her cheek. "I didn't hear you come upstairs. You're up early." Daniel shoved his hands deep into his pockets, his fingers wrapping tightly around the cold, jagged edge of the silver key. The sharp metal bit into his skin, a grounding pain that kept him from screaming. "Just checking the weather," Daniel said, his voice flat, devoid of any inflection. "Looks like the rain finally stopped." He looked at his wife, but he didn't see her anymore. He only saw the locked door at the Meridian, and the ghost of the man waiting on the other side. The dining room of the Bellevue house was bathed in the warm, amber glow of the sculptural chandelier Carmen had imported from Copenhagen. The table was set with heavy linen napkins and crystal wine glasses that caught the light, refracting it into tiny, sharp prisms across the dark mahogany wood. It was a masterpiece of domestic staging. Mark Stevens and Nicole Davis sat across from them, laughing at a punchline Carmen had just delivered with flawless comedic timing. Mark, a fellow engineer at Pemberton Tech, was halfway through his second glass of Pinot Noir, his face flushed with relaxed contentment. Nicole, a real estate agent who had helped Daniel and Carmen find this very house, was practically beaming at her hostess. "I just don't know how you do it, Carmen," Nicole said. reaching across the table to affectionately squeeze Carmen's wrist. The exact same wrist Daniel had watched Tyler Blackstroke 3 days ago. Managing the firm, dealing with those nightmare Mercer Island clients, and still throwing a dinner party like this on a Saturday night. You two are exhausting to be around. Carmen offered a modest, self-deprecating smile. She reached out, placing her hand gently over Daniel's where it rested beside his plate. Her palm was warm. Her skin was soft. "I have a very supportive husband," she said, her voice dripping with a manufactured sweetness that made the wine in Daniel's stomach threaten to come back up. "Daniel is my rock. I couldn't juggle it all without him." Daniel stared at her hand covering his. He did not pull away. He commanded his facial muscles to form a gentle, appreciative smile. He was learning that betrayal was not just an act. It was an entirely new language, and he was becoming terrifyingly fluent in it. "Well, here is to the rock," Mark chuckled, raising his glass. "And to the architect who keeps him polished. To 7 years, you guys. Still the gold standard." "To us?" Carmen murmured, clinking her glass against Daniel's, her dark eyes locking onto his with a gaze so deeply affectionate it felt like a physical assault. Daniel raised his glass. "To us," he echoed. The syllables tasted like ash. He took a slow sip of the wine, letting the dark, heavy liquid coat his throat. The dinner progressed through courses of roasted lamb and truffle risotto, a symphony of culinary perfection that Daniel chewed mechanically, completely devoid of taste. He watched his wife operate. He observed the micro-adjustments in her posture, the way she mirrored Nicole's body language to build rapport, the way she effortlessly deflected Mark's questions about her recent sudden trip to Portland. She wove a tapestry of minor fabrications and half-truths so intricately that even Daniel, knowing the absolute truth, found himself momentarily mesmerized by the performance. If she could lie this beautifully to her best friends over a $200 bottle of wine, what else was she capable of? The heavy silver key to the Meridian sat upstairs, locked in the biometric safe in his office, but its weight pressed down on Daniel's chest, suffocating him. He realized, with a creeping sense of horror, that the woman sitting beside him was not simply unhappy in her marriage. She was a sociopath of domesticity. "So, Daniel," Nicole shifted her attention, leaning forward. "Mark tells me Pemberton is gearing up for a massive IPO push next quarter. That stock of yours is going to turn this house into a guest cottage." Carmen's eyes brightened just a fraction of a percent. It was an involuntary reaction, a microscopic tightening of the muscles around her eyes that anyone else would have missed. But Daniel saw it. He saw the cold, calculating glint of a woman evaluating an asset. "It's a possibility," Daniel said, keeping his voice perfectly level, carefully cutting a piece of meat he had no intention of eating. "We're focusing on the immediate deliverables. Whatever happens with the stock is just noise right now." He looked directly at Carmen, allowing a brief, impenetrable silence to settle over the table. "We already have everything we need right here, don't we, sweetheart?" Carmen blinked, the faintest flicker of uncertainty crossing her features before the mask perfectly reassembled. "Of course we do," she smiled, but the light in her eyes had gone entirely dead. The elevator in the Meridian did not hum. It simply glided upward in a vacuum of absolute luxury, ascending to the 42nd floor. Daniel Foster stood alone in the brushed steel cab, staring blankly at the illuminated numbers. He had told his team at Pemberton Tech he had a sudden dental emergency. Carmen had texted him an hour ago, complaining about a difficult fabric vendor in the Pioneer Square district, complete with a photograph of a fabric swatch. The silver key fob burned a cold, heavy circle against his palm. The doors parted with a soft chime, revealing a private, softly lit vestibule. There was only one door. Unit 4201. Daniel stepped onto the thick charcoal carpet, the oppressive silence of the high-rise pressing against his eardrums. He inserted the physical key he had extracted from the fob into the lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click of precision engineering. He pushed the door open. The first thing that hit him was the air. It was climate-controlled perfection, carrying the distinct, devastatingly familiar scent of Carmen's, expensive Le Labo perfume mixed with the sharp, masculine notes of sandalwood and bergamot. It was the exact smell that had clung to her trench coat the night of the dinner party. Daniel stepped inside and closed the door behind him, locking it automatically. He was a trespasser in a world entirely funded and designed by his wife for another man. The apartment was a masterpiece of modern, sensual design. Far warmer, darker, and more intimate than the sterile, minimalist glass box they shared in Bellevue. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, dizzying view of the Puget Sound, the gray water churning beneath the overcast Seattle sky. The furniture was low, plush, and upholstered in deep emerald velvets and rich cognac leathers. It was an environment designed purely for pleasure and escape. He moved slowly, like a ghost haunting his own life. On the kitchen island, a massive slab of black marble, sat two unwashed crystal tumblers next to a half-empty bottle of Macallan 18. Daniel didn't drink scotch. Tyler Black clearly did. He walked down the short hallway, his heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The bedroom door was partially open. Daniel pushed it ajar and stopped. The breath left his lungs in a ragged, silent exhale. The bed, massive and draped in dark linen, was unmade. The indentation of two bodies was clearly visible in the tangled sheets. On the nightstand rested a pair of silver cufflinks and a heavy men's watch. But what paralyzed Daniel, anchoring him to the hardwood floor, was the framed photograph on the dresser. It was not a professional studio shot. It was a candid Polaroid. Carmen and Tyler, taken somewhere blindingly sunny, perhaps a balcony in Napa or a private terrace in Cabo. Tyler was kissing the side of her neck, and Carmen was laughing, her head thrown back, her eyes closed in an expression of pure, uninhibited bliss. It was a freezing capture of a woman completely and utterly in love. For a terrifying 10 seconds, Daniel's vision swam. The urge to sweep his arm across the dresser, to shatter the glass, to rip the sheets from the bed and set the entire magnificent illusion on fire, surged through his veins with violent intensity. His hands curled into tight fists, his fingernails biting painfully into his palms. The silence of the apartment roared in his ears. Breathe, his mind commanded, a desperate override from the architect of systems. If you break the system, you lose the data. If you lose the data, you lose the war. Slowly, agonizingly, he unspooled his fists. He pulled his phone from his coat pocket. With surgical, deadened detachment, he photographed the room. He photographed the empty scotch glasses. He photographed the watch and the unmade bed. Finally, he stood directly over the dresser and photographed the Polaroid, capturing his wife's radiant betrayal in high resolution. He touched nothing. He left the air exactly as he found it. Daniel turned his back on the bedroom, walked out of Unit 4201, and locked the door behind him, leaving his heart on the dark linen sheets while he carried the evidence of its murder out into the cold Seattle afternoon. The law offices of Miller and Associates occupied the top floor of a steel and glass monolith that pierced the low-hanging Seattle clouds. The aesthetic was aggressively clinical, white marble, brushed chrome, and the distinct, unnerving silence that only exorbitant billing rates could buy. Daniel Foster sat rigidly in a leather wingback chair, his hands folded perfectly in his lap, watching the rain streak relentlessly across the floor-to-ceiling windows. Across the expansive mahogany desk sat Greg Miller. Greg was a man who made a highly lucrative living dismantling the exact type of upper-class marital architecture Daniel and Carmen had spent 7 years building. He was currently reviewing the encrypted drive Daniel had handed him 10 minutes prior. "The financial forensics are impressively thorough, Daniel," Greg said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone entirely devoid of any sympathetic inflection. He clicked through the high-resolution images of the Meridian apartment, pausing briefly on the Polaroid of Carmen and Tyler Black. "You extracted all of this without alerting her? She believes I'm at a dental specialist," Daniel replied, the words tasting like chalk in his dry mouth. "And she thinks her digital footprint is secure. It isn't." Greg leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Washington is a community property state. Without a prenuptial agreement, the default position is that everything acquired during the marriage, including your unvested Pemberton tech stock options, is subject to a 50-50 split. Daniel felt a familiar, cold tightening in his chest. A decade of 80-hour work weeks, of building scalable infrastructures late into the night, of sacrificing his own youth to secure their joint future. All of it was on the chopping block because his wife needed a luxurious, panoramic playground for her infidelity. However, Greg continued, a sharp, predatory glint appearing behind his wire-rimmed glasses. The existence of the hidden LLC, the secret bank account, and the commercial lease at the Meridian changes the calculus significantly. This isn't just an affair, Daniel. This is the systemic dissipation of marital assets to fund a parallel lifestyle. It is premeditated financial fraud against the marital estate. Can we protect the stock? Daniel asked. His voice was hollow, stripped of the agonizing, suffocating grief that had choked him while standing in her secret apartment. Here, in this sterile room, he was simply an engineer patching a catastrophic systemic failure. With this evidence? Absolutely, Greg said, tapping the edge of the monitor. We argue that her active deception and deliberate financial drain negate her claim to the equitable distribution of your specific post-discovery assets. We freeze the joint accounts. We file for a temporary restraining order on the Pemberton shares. We build a wall so high and so legally reinforced that if she tries to climb it, she bankrupts herself in litigation. Daniel stared blindly at the photograph of his wife glowing on the screen. 7 years of shared holidays, whispered secrets in the dark, and private inside jokes were now reduced to leverage in a corporate negotiation. The woman he loved had died in a velvet booth at Café Lumière, and he was currently negotiating with her ghost over the remaining inventory. When do we file? Daniel asked, finally tearing his eyes away from the digital ghost of his marriage. I can have the initial injunctions ready by Monday morning, Greg said, closing the laptop with a decisive, echoing snap. But until the ink is on the paper and the filings are stamped by the clerk, she cannot know. You have to maintain the baseline. You have to go home, eat dinner with her, look her in the eye and smile. Daniel stood up, the weight of the silver key fob still a heavy, physical anchor in his coat pocket. He didn't just have to smile. He had to set the stage for the demolition. I'll handle my end, Daniel said quietly, turning toward the heavy glass door. Have the papers ready. He walked out of the office and into the elevator, the rapid descent plunging him back into the gray, relentless reality of the city. The financial firewall was built. The assets were legally secured. Now all that remained was the execution. It was time to invite his wife to lunch. At precisely 12:30 on Monday afternoon, Daniel Foster sat in the back velvet booth of Café Lumière. Outside, the Seattle mist had thickened into a steady, freezing downpour, blurring the neon sign in the window. He had arrived 20 minutes early. He did not order the hazelnut cake. He ordered a black coffee, untouched, letting it grow cold as he watched the door. At 9:15 that morning, Greg Miller had texted him a single word. Filed. The financial injunctions were active. The Pemberton tech stock was frozen behind a legal firewall. The joint accounts were locked. Daniel was no longer a husband in peril. He was an architect watching a controlled demolition. The bell above the cafe door chimed. Carmen stepped inside, shaking the water from her sleek black umbrella. She spotted him immediately, her face breaking into a bright, surprised smile. She navigated the tight arrangement of wrought iron chairs, slipping gracefully into the booth opposite him. A midday date, she said, her voice light and teasing as she unbuttoned her coat. You are full of surprises lately, Daniel. I had to reschedule a vendor meeting, but I couldn't say no. It's been ages since we came here. It has, Daniel agreed. His voice was perfectly level. He rested his hands on the table, his fingers loosely intertwined. A waiter approached and Carmen immediately ordered a slice of the hazelnut cake and a latte. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the marble, her dark eyes sparkling with an entirely fabricated warmth. She began to speak about her morning, detailing a fictional argument with a contractor in Queen and regarding imported tile. Daniel listened. He watched the animated movement of her hands, the slight tilt of her head, the effortless flow of the lie. It was a masterful performance, polished by months of practice. He allowed her to speak for exactly 3 minutes, absorbing the sheer scale of her deception one final time. Then, he reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. His fingers closed around the heavy, cold metal of the silver security fob. He pulled his hand out, keeping his fist closed, and rested it on the table, right next to the porcelain saucer of his cold coffee. Carmen paused mid-sentence, her eyes dropping to his closed hand. A faint crease appeared between her brows. "Daniel? What is it?" Slowly, deliberately, Daniel opened his hand. He placed the key fob flat on the table, the stylized, geometric M facing upward. With his index finger, he slid the heavy piece of silver across the smooth marble. It made a sharp, grating sound, a microscopic scratch on the pristine surface, until it stopped exactly an inch from her fingertips. Carmen looked down. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum that sucked the ambient noise of the cafe, the clinking of silverware, the hiss of the espresso machine, the low murmur of other patrons, entirely out of Daniel's perception. He watched the precise moment the architecture of her reality collapsed. The polite confusion in her eyes hardened into a rigid, panicked stare. The color drained from her face in a rapid, visible wave, leaving her skin the color of old parchment. Her breath hitched, catching sharply in her throat, but she did not move. She stared at the M, as if it were a venomous insect. "You left it in the lining of the Milan bag," Daniel said. His voice was quiet, stripped of any malice, anger, or sorrow. It was a simple statement of data. Unit 4201. Carmen's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted from the key to his face, frantically searching for the Daniel she knew, the predictable, manageable husband. She found only a stranger looking back at her. The waiter arrived, cheerfully placing the hazelnut cake between them, completely oblivious to the massacre that had just occurred. Daniel stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, his movements methodical and unhurried. He did not look at the cake. "Miller and Associates will serve you at your office by 3 o'clock, Daniel said, looking down at his wife's paralyzed, ashen face. "Do not come back to Bellevue." He turned and walked out into the freezing rain, leaving her sitting in the velvet booth with her beautiful smile permanently broken. The heavy oak front door of the Bellevue house shuddered violently before swinging open. Daniel stood in the center of the living room, a roll of packing tape in his hand. He had intended to pack a single suitcase of Carmen's essentials to leave on the porch, enforcing his boundary. He hadn't expected her to breach it so quickly. Carmen stood in the entryway, shivering uncontrollably. She had lost her umbrella somewhere between the downtown core and the suburbs. Her camel trench coat was soaked black across the shoulders, and the pristine, polished architect from Café Lumière was entirely gone. In her place was a frantic, unspooling woman, her mascara tracing jagged dark lines down her pale cheeks. "You can't do this?" she gasped, her chest heaving as she stepped onto the hardwood floor, leaving a trail of muddy water. "Daniel, you cannot just shut me out and freeze my life. The lawyers, the stock. You're trying to destroy me." Daniel calmly set the packing tape on the kitchen island. "You destroyed yourself. I am simply documenting the wreckage." "It was a mistake," she screamed, the sound raw and agonizing, bouncing off the high concrete walls. She lunged forward, grabbing his forearm with icy, trembling fingers. "It was Tyler, just Tyler. He's a venture capitalist I met at a gala. He listened to me, Daniel. You were always at Pemberton. You were always buried in your code. I was suffocating in this perfect, empty house." Daniel looked down at her hands clutching his arm. He felt a chilling absence of empathy. The financial firewall had done its job. It had severed his emotional spinal cord. "You leased a luxury apartment, Carmen. You funneled marital assets into a secret account for 8 months. That is not suffocation. That is premeditated construction. I was going to end it," she sobbed, her grip tightening desperately. "I swear to you I was looking for a way out. It got out of hand." But it meant nothing, Daniel. It was just a stupid physical escape. Please, you have to believe me. It's not like what happened in Chicago. I learned my lesson then. I swear. Carmen's mouth snapped shut. Her teeth clicked together with an audible sound. Her eyes widened, the sheer, sudden terror in them eclipsing the panic of the divorce papers. The silence in the house grew so heavy it felt as though the atmospheric pressure had suddenly tripled. Daniel did not move. His brain, wired to process complex datasets and identify anomalies, instantly locked onto the new variable. Chicago. 5 years ago. A week-long architectural conference. She had come back glowing, claiming the Midwestern air had rejuvenated her creativity. Chicago, Daniel repeated. The word sounded foreign on his tongue. Daniel, no, please, I didn't mean, she stammered, frantically shaking her head, taking a staggering step backward. Who was in Chicago, Carmen? His voice was a terrifying whisper, devoid of any human warmth. It was the sound of a machine analyzing a fatal, unrecoverable error. She covered her mouth with both hands, a muffled, wretched sob tearing through her chest. It was nobody, a colleague. It was one night 5 years ago. I was so drunk, and we had been fighting about your promotion. Daniel, please, it was only once before Tyler. I swear. The second knife slid in silently, bypassing the ribs and piercing directly into the remaining, fragile shreds of Daniel's reality. Tyler Black was not the earthquake that shattered their foundation. Tyler was just the aftershock. The foundation had collapsed 5 years ago, while Daniel had been happily, ignorantly building their future on top of the rubble. He had been married to a ghost for half a decade. Every anniversary, every shared holiday, every whispered confession in the dark since Chicago had been a masterclass in sociopathic theater. The woman weeping in his hallway was not his wife. She was a stranger who had merely worn his wife's face to comfortably fund her existence. Let go of my arm, Daniel said. She recoiled as if he had burned her. Daniel turned his back on her, walking methodically toward the staircase. Take whatever you can carry to your car, he said, not looking back. If you are not gone in 15 minutes, I will call the police and have you removed for trespassing. Carmen did not leave forever. She disappeared into the freezing rain that Tuesday evening, but 48 hours later, the heavy deadbolt of the Bellevue house clicked open. She returned not as a weeping, apologetic wife, but as an entrenched combatant following the strict instructions of her newly retained divorce attorney. To abandon the primary residence was to surrender a tactical advantage in the asset division. Thus began the purgatory. The sprawling, minimalist house transformed into a multi-million-dollar prison cell. The battle lines were drawn entirely in silence. Daniel relocated his essential belongings to the downstairs office, installing a heavy-duty lock on the door. Carmen maintained her occupation of the master suite upstairs. They began living in staggered, meticulously timed shifts to avoid the physical agonizing reality of each other's presence. If Daniel was brewing coffee in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, Carmen remained upstairs until she heard the garage door close. If she was in the living room, staring blankly at the dark television screen, Daniel walked straight past the arched doorway without turning his head. The silence between them was not peaceful. It was radioactive. It pulsed with the toxic, unspoken weight of everything that had been destroyed. Daniel found himself operating in a state of hypervigilant exhaustion. He went to Pemberton Tech, wrote immaculate, bug-free code for 10 hours a day, and returned to a house that felt like a crime scene. He began to look at the physical objects around him not as possessions, but as timeline markers of her deception. The expensive espresso machine on the counter, purchased 3 years ago. After Chicago, the custom-built mahogany dining table where they had hosted countless dinner parties, commissioned 4 years ago. After Chicago, every memory he possessed from the last half-decade was infected. He would lie awake on the narrow leather sofa in his office, staring at the ceiling, replaying vacations, anniversaries, and quiet Sunday mornings, realizing that the woman smiling at him in all those memories had been carrying the ghost of another man's touch. Tyler Black, the venture capitalist with the silver key, was merely the catalyst for the explosion. The foundation had been rotten for 5 years. One evening in the 3rd week of this suffocating arrangement, the system failed. Daniel worked late and returned to the house at 9 o'clock. He walked into the kitchen to get a glass of water and froze. Carmen was standing by the marble island. She was wearing an old, faded Pemberton Tech t-shirt, one of his shirts, and holding a mug of tea. The sheer, audacious cruelty of her wearing his clothing hit Daniel like a physical blow to the sternum. She looked up, her dark eyes hollow, the skin beneath them bruised with exhaustion. The polished armor of the successful architect had entirely rusted away. For 10 agonizing seconds, they simply stared at each other across the polished stone. The distance between them was only 6 feet, but it was an unbridgeable, terrifying chasm. Daniel saw the muscles in her throat work as she swallowed heavily. She opened her mouth, the desperate, pathetic need to speak, to bridge the silence, radiating from her rigid posture. She wanted to apologize again. She wanted to explain the unexplainable. Daniel didn't give her the chance. He set his empty glass carefully on the counter, the faint click of glass on stone echoing loudly in the quiet room. He turned his back on her, walking down the hall and locking himself inside his office, leaving her alone with the ghost she had invited into their home. The physical dismantling of a 7-year marriage took exactly 6 weeks. By the 2nd week of November, the Bellevue house had transformed into a sterile landscape of brown corrugated cardboard. Daniel Foster stood in the center of the living room, methodically wrapping his collection of architectural history books in bubble wrap. The oppressive silence of the house was broken only by the harsh, tearing sound of packing tape. He did not hear Carmen come downstairs. He only noticed her when her shadow fell across the half-filled box. Daniel paused, the tape dispenser heavy in his hand, and looked up. The woman standing before him bore almost no resemblance to the radiant, impossibly glamorous architect he had watched through the fogged glass of Café Lumière. Carmen had lost a concerning amount of weight. Her cheekbones were sharp, her skin carried a translucent, unhealthy pallor, and her dark eyes were completely hollowed out, rimmed with the deep purple of chronic insomnia. She was wearing a heavy cashmere sweater that seemed to swallow her fragile frame. "I signed the preliminary settlement," she said. Her voice was a fragile, papery whisper that barely carried across the room. "Greg Miller sent the digital copies this morning. You get the Pemberton stock. You keep the house. I take the firm's assets and the remaining balance of the joint savings." "I know," Daniel said evenly. He pressed a strip of tape across the top of the box, smoothing down the edges with his thumb. "My attorney notified me." Carmen did not move away. Instead, she took a trembling step closer, crossing the invisible boundary they had meticulously maintained for over a month. She looked down at his hands, then up at his face. The rigid, defensive posture she had held since the day he confronted her completely shattered. Her shoulders collapsed inward, and a sudden, violent sob tore from her throat. She dropped to her knees. It was not a calculated, theatrical gesture. It was a complete physical failure, the gravity of her ruined life finally crushing her legs. She knelt on the imported hardwood floor amidst the cardboard boxes, weeping with a raw, ugly sound that echoed terribly in the empty space. "Daniel, please," she gasped, wrapping her arms around her own torso as if trying to hold her ribs together. "Please, I am begging you. I know it's too late. I know I killed it, but I don't know how to exist without you." Daniel looked down at his wife. He searched his chest for the familiar, agonizing spike of adrenaline, the desperate urge to reach out and pull her off the floor, to smooth her hair and tell her he would fix it. He found nothing but a vast, frozen expanse. The financial firewall had protected his life's work, but the psychological firewall he had built after the revelation of Chicago had permanently cauterized his heart. "Get up, Carmen," he said, his voice quiet and devoid of cruelty. "I was empty," she choked out, ignoring his command, her tears dripping onto the pristine floorboards. "I was so empty inside, and I kept trying to fill it with the thrill of being wanted by strangers. Tyler, Chicago. They were just Novocaine. You were the only real thing I ever had. I see it now. I see what I threw away. Please, Daniel, let me earn you back. Take 10 years. Take the rest of my life. Just don't make me sign the final decree. It was the ultimate plea. It was the absolute surrender Daniel might have prayed for on that first, nauseating night standing in the rain outside the cafe. But he was no longer the man who had stood in the rain. You aren't grieving the loss of me? Daniel said slowly, setting the tape dispenser on the table. You are grieving the loss of your safety net. You used my stability to comfortably fund your chaos. And now the funding is gone. Carmen looked up at him, her wet face stricken, her mouth opening in a silent cry of pure agony. She understood, in that exact second, that the judgment was absolute. There was no warmth left to harvest. I can't save you from yourself, Daniel added. He stepped around her kneeling form, picking up another empty box. Have the rest of your things out by Sunday. The conference room at Miller & Associates was freezing. It was the second Tuesday of December, exactly 3 months to the day since Daniel Foster had taken a detour past Café Lumière in the rain. Across the expansive mahogany table sat a thick, meticulously bound stack of legal documents. The final decree of dissolution of marriage. Greg Miller stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling Seattle skyline, giving Daniel the illusion of privacy. Everything is executed exactly as we planned, Greg said, his gravelly voice low, not turning around. The Pemberton Tech stock options are fully secured and vested in your name. The joint accounts have been severed and distributed according to the injunctions. The Bellevue property officially closed yesterday. Your half of the equity has already cleared into your private trust. She signed her copies an hour ago. Daniel stared at the top page. It was a sterile, bureaucratic tombstone for a marriage that had died half a decade ago in Chicago. He picked up the heavy black Mont Blanc pen from the table. The metal felt cold against his skin, a sharp contrast to the weight of the silver key fob he had carried in his pocket for weeks. A ghost he had finally laid to rest. He thought about Carmen. He hadn't seen her since the afternoon she collapsed weeping among the moving boxes. He knew, through the sterile, transactional updates of their respective attorneys, that she had moved into a modest, cramped apartment in Capitol Hill. The extravagant commercial lease at the Meridian had been broken, costing her a small fortune in penalties and draining the last of her available capital. Tyler Black had, predictably, vanished the moment the financial and legal fallout began to threaten his own public image. Carmen was entirely alone, left to reconstruct a reality without the emotional and financial safety net she had so carelessly exploited. Daniel uncapped the pen. He should have felt a profound sense of triumph. He had won the war. He had reverse-engineered the most devastating betrayal of his life, bypassed his own blinding grief, and built a flawless, impenetrable firewall around his future. He was a wealthy, successful architect of systems, and his system had survived a catastrophic attack. But as he lowered the nib of the pen toward the thick, textured paper, a heavy, suffocating pressure seized his chest. It wasn't regret. He knew, with absolute, chilling certainty, that he could never spend another second in the same room as the woman who had smiled at another man with such uninhibited devotion. He wasn't grieving the loss of Carmen. He was grieving the death of his own innocence. He was mourning the Daniel Foster who had believed in shared hazelnut cake, quiet Sundays, and the fundamental honesty of the woman sleeping beside him. He pressed the pen to the signature line. Daniel Foster. As the black ink flowed smoothly onto the page, finalizing the destruction of his past, a sudden, blinding sting hit his eyes. He didn't sob. His posture remained rigidly perfect. But a single, heavy drop of water slipped from his jaw, landing directly on the bottom edge of the document. It soaked quickly into the parchment, slightly blurring the final loop of his last name. It was the only tear he had shed in 3 months. A bitter, silent eulogy for a love that never actually existed. Daniel capped the pen and pushed the heavy stack of documents across the mahogany table. Greg Miller turned around, looking at the blurred ink, and nodded once. A silent, professional acknowledgement of the completed transaction. Daniel stood up, buttoned his dark wool coat, and walked out of the conference room. He descended the elevator in absolute silence, stepping out of the glass tower and into the freezing, familiar Seattle mist. The ink dried on the paper, securing his future, but the man who loved her had already bled out on the pavement outside Café Lumière.